Let me ask you something before I tell you anything about Caleb Morrison. Think about the most dependable person in your life. Not the most exciting one, not the funniest one at the table. The one who actually shows up, the one who answers the phone at 11 at night when everyone else has gone to sleep, the one who drives the extra hour when something goes wrong, the one who reads the instructions everyone else ignores and quietly makes sure the thing doesn't fall apart. You have that person in your head? Good. Now ask yourself this. When was the last time you said their name in a room full of people, not to ask them for something, but just to say it? Just to let everyone know this person is here, this person exists, this person has been carrying something no one has been weighing? Take a second with that, because here's what I've noticed, and I've been turning this over for a while now. The most dependable people are often the most invisible ones. Not invisible like a ghost, invisible like a wall, like something so structural to the life around them that people forget it wasn't always there. Forget someone built it. Forget someone gets up every morning and checks if it still needs repair. And sometimes the invisible person finally looks around and realizes that the house they spent years maintaining, it was never put in their name. That's Caleb's story. I want to be honest with you from the beginning. This is not a simple story. Caleb Morrison did not come out of what happened to him clean and triumphant. He came out changed, which is a different thing entirely. And I'm not going to stand here and tell you every decision he made was right, because I'm genuinely not sure, and I think that uncertainty is the most honest thing I can offer you. What I am sure of is this. What happened to Caleb raised a question that I think a lot of people carry around without a good answer. And that question is, at what point does loyalty become a trap? And who gets to decide when you've finally given enough? I'm still working on that one. Maybe by the end of this, so will you. My name's not important right now. What matters is Caleb. Let me tell you about a man who spent 8 years painting a green rocking chair, and what he found out when the chair was gone. Caleb Morrison was 45 years old and had been teaching high school history in Columbus, Ohio for 18 years. That matters, actually. 18 years at the same school, the same building, the same third-floor classroom with the radiator that rattled every February and the window that looked out over the athletic field. 18 years of juniors and seniors who thought history was the most boring subject alive until they sat in his class and realized he was teaching them the story of every bad decision a group of people had ever made together, and the few extraordinary ones who'd seen it coming and said so anyway. His students had a name for his particular laugh. The gradebook laugh, they called it. He almost never laughed out loud. He was quiet in that way. Careful, but sometimes something would genuinely catch him, and he'd make this short, surprised sound through his nose, almost like he was startled by his own amusement. They said he only did it when something was actually funny, not polite funny. Apparently, that distinction mattered to them. He drove a 10-year-old Subaru Outback with a cracked passenger side mirror he'd been meaning to replace for 2 years. He lived in a rented house in Clintonville, 6 blocks from a coffee shop he went to every Saturday morning, and ordered the same thing: a large black coffee and a plain bagel, toasted, and sat in the corner booth and read. Not on his phone. An actual book. He bought them used. He was not, by most people's definition, a dramatic person. But let me tell you about the 8 years. When Caleb's mother, Ruth, was diagnosed with Alzheimer's at 72, Caleb was 37 and still living in Columbus. He'd come back from a brief stint in Cleveland after a relationship ended, and he'd settled back into the city with the ease of someone who had never fully left. His mother was 40 minutes away in Bexley, in the same bungalow he and his sister Vivienne had grown up in. 3 bedrooms, a detached garage that smelled like motor oil and old newspaper, a front porch with a wooden rocking chair his mother had painted, and this is important, a very specific shade of green. She called it wren green, not forest green, which was too dark, not sage, which was too gray. Wren green, like the soft brown-green belly of the small bird she fed seed to every morning in a ceramic dish she kept on the porch railing. The birds came so regularly that she'd named 2 of them. A fact she found mildly embarrassing, but not embarrassing enough to stop. The day she told Caleb about the diagnosis, she was sitting in that green rocking chair with a cup of tea she'd forgotten she'd made. The cup had been sitting there cold for probably an hour. She wasn't worried about it. She looked at him with the steady, clear eyes she still had then, and said, "I need you to know, I'm still me, Caleb. I want you to remember that part. The part where I'm still me, for when I'm not anymore." He remembered. He drove to Bexley at least twice a week after that. Then, 3 times. Then he was there more than he was home. And eventually, the geometry of his life rearranged itself around his mother's needs. The way water rearranges itself around again. So gradually, you don't notice until the banks have shifted completely. He hired a part-time aide named Gloria, who came Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. He handled the billing, the insurance calls, the medication schedule, the grocery runs, the appointments. He learned which shampoo kept his mother's scalp from drying out. He learned that she slept better when the hall light was left on. He learned that she still responded to music specifically, to a Patsy Cline record. His father had left behind even on the days when she couldn't reliably place Caleb's face in the category of people she knew. He did not complain about this. That's also important. He called Vivienne twice a month, sometimes more. Vivienne lived in Seattle with her husband Kevin and their 3 kids. She worked as a marketing director for a fitness company, the kind that sells you the idea of transformation alongside the gear for it. She was good at her job. She was magnetic in the way that some people are, the kind of charming that fills a room immediately and makes strangers want to confide in her after one conversation. She sent gifts at holidays. She called on birthdays. She FaceTimed with their mother on Sunday evenings 20 minutes, sometimes 30. And Ruth always seemed to brighten for the call. Vivienne came home twice in those 8 years. Once for Christmas, the winter after the diagnosis, when Ruth was still mostly herself, still sharp, still making the peach preserves she gave to neighbors every August in recycled mason jars she washed and labeled by hand. The second time was 3 years before Ruth died, in the spring. Kevin had a conference in Cincinnati, and Vivienne had tagged along, and she spent 4 days in Columbus, which everyone agreed was a wonderful visit. In between those 2 visits, Caleb. Now, I want to stop here for a moment, because I've heard people say I've heard this specific thing said that long-distance caregiving is just as hard as being present. The worry, the guilt, the helplessness. And I think that's true. I think Vivienne probably did feel those things. But there is a specific kind of tiredness that only comes from being in the room. From watching someone you love reach for a word they used to have easy access to and coming up empty. From the bureaucracy of illness, the pharmacy calls, the insurance denials, the paperwork that multiplies every time you think you've caught up. From driving to Bexley on a Tuesday night, because your mother left the stove on again, and sitting with her until she's calm, and then driving back to your house and trying to plan tomorrow's lesson about the legislative compromises of 1,850. There is no equivalent for that feeling in a FaceTime call. That's not a criticism. It's just a fact. Caleb never said any of this out loud. Not to Vivienne, not to his Aunt Dottie, not to anyone, except, occasionally, late at night, to his friend Petra, who was a pediatric nurse, and therefore understood long distance the particular weight of care that people outside medicine don't have names for. "You're allowed to be tired," Petra told him once. She was on her 2nd cup of instant coffee, which she made without irony, in a kitchen that contained a cat named Dostoevsky and a coat track made from a branch she'd found in Schiller Park. "I know," Caleb said. "You're not acting like it." He didn't answer that one. He looked out her window at the street instead. That was the thing about Caleb when something landed too close. He looked away. not rudely, quietly. For the last 2 years of Ruth's life, she did not consistently know Caleb's name. She knew his face. She knew he was safe. She reached for his hand sometimes when he sat beside her, and held it with the specific grip of someone who has misplaced the language for what they mean, but not the meaning itself. He sat with her like that for hours sometimes. The Patsy Cline record playing, the green rocking chair on the porch, visible through the window. The birds coming for the ceramic dish that Caleb kept filled because his mother had asked him to and he wasn't about to stop now. In the last October, Caleb repainted the chair. The winter before had stripped the color down to bare wood in patches, the way Ohio winters do to everything that hasn't been properly sealed against them. He drove 20 minutes to a hardware store in Westerville, the only one that could match the shade exactly because he had the color code saved in his phone since the first time he'd done this, 4 years earlier. He repainted it on a Saturday. His mother watched from the window. She didn't say anything. But when he came inside and washed the paint off his hands, she looked at him and said, "Clearly, you're a good boy, Caleb." It was the last time she said his name. She died in January, in the bedroom she'd slept in for 40 years, on a Tuesday morning, with Caleb sitting in the chair beside her bed and Gloria standing in the doorway holding a cup of tea no one would drink. He called Vivienne from the driveway, standing in the cold without his coat. She cried. He held the phone against his ear and looked at the green chair on the porch and didn't say much. There wasn't much to say. They talked about flights and arrangements and the people who'd need to be called, the mechanics of loss, because sometimes that's all the space there is. Vivienne arrived 2 days later. She had the particular quality of grief that photographs well, very real, very present, and somehow also composed, as if the sadness and the competence were running in parallel channels. Kevin came with her. The kids stayed with Kevin's mother in Seattle. The service was held on a Friday. The bungalow in Bexley smelled like the lilies someone had sent, and the coffee cake Dottie had brought, and underneath it all, just faintly, the way certain houses hold a smell against all attempts to change it. The peach preserves. The empty jars were still on the shelf in the pantry. Vivienne brought a pie from a Seattle bakery. She'd packed it in her carry-on. It sat on the counter in a white box tied with twine, and no one touched it. The day after the funeral, they sat at the kitchen table with Ruth's attorney, a man named Harold Fenwick, who was 60-something and wore bifocals, and had drawn up Ruth's will 4 years prior, and Caleb found out what his mother had done. The will was not what Caleb expected. He hadn't expected much, to be honest. The house, some savings, the furniture, the preserving equipment, the Patsy Cline record, and whatever else Ruth had accumulated in 79 years of careful living, to be divided equally. He hadn't thought about it in detail. There wasn't a reason to. The will Harold Fenwick set before them was not the will Ruth had drawn up 4 years ago. It had been amended. 18 months earlier, during a 4-day window in which Vivienne had visited a visit, Caleb had not known about until this moment, sitting at his mother's kitchen table, reading a legal document that felt like something from someone else's life. The amended will left the house and 70% of Ruth's savings to Vivienne. Caleb received 30%. And the contents of the house, meaning the furniture, the dishes, the things that had no monetary value, and all the weight in the world. Harold Fenwick cleared his throat in the way that lawyers do when they have known something uncomfortable for a long time and are now officially releasing it into the room. Caleb read the document twice. Then he set it down on the table very carefully. The way you set something down when you're making sure not to throw it. She amended it 18 months ago, he said. That's correct. Was she what was her capacity at that point? Harold Fenwick looked at his hands. She was assessed and found to have adequate capacity for the purpose of amending the document. There was a physician's evaluation. Who arranged the physician's evaluation? A pause. Vivienne was looking at the window. Kevin was looking at Vivienne. The amendment was initiated during a visit from your sister, Harold said. The kitchen was very quiet. Caleb looked at Vivienne. She looked back at him. Her face was not what he expected. It wasn't guilt, exactly. It was the face of someone who has already had this conversation with themselves many times and arrived at a conclusion they could live with. She wanted to make sure I'd be okay, Vivienne said. Her voice was even. She was worried about me. I have 3 kids, Caleb. Kevin's business has been we've had a hard few years. She was worried about you. She loved us both. She didn't know who I was by the end, Caleb said. His voice came out flat. Not angry. Flat. For the last year and a half, she looked at me, and she knew I was safe. But she didn't always have my name. She held my hand. I was there 3 days a week. And 18 months ago, you flew in and arranged an evaluation and had her sign a document. Vivienne's jaw tightened. That's not how it happened. Tell me how it happened, she told him. And in the telling, Caleb understood that she genuinely believed the version she was telling, that their mother had brought it up herself, that Vivienne had only tried to help facilitate what Ruth wanted, that the physician had confirmed Ruth's capacity, that it was all above board, all legal, all done with good intentions. The problem was that good intentions and harm are not mutually exclusive. He didn't say that. He stood up from the table, picked up his copy of the amended will, folded it once, put it in his jacket pocket, and said, I need some air. He went out to the porch. He sat in the green rocking chair for a long time. The birds were gone January. No seed in the dish, no reason for them to come. The dish was still there. The porch railing, the front yard where he'd mowed the grass for 8 summers, the sidewalk he'd salted every winter so his mother wouldn't slip. He wasn't sure how long he sat there. Long enough that Vivienne came to the door twice and didn't say anything and went back in both times. The third time, it was Dottie who came out. Dottie Webb was Ruth's younger sister, 63, and the self-appointed emotional anchor of the Morrison family. She ran her household with a whiteboard calendar in the kitchen that color-coded every family member's significant events, birthdays, appointments, graduations. She had found this system in a family organization blog in 2018 and had not stopped refining it since. Caleb's color on the calendar was blue. Vivienne's was yellow. He'd noticed years ago and chosen not to think about it. Dottie sat in the other porch chair, the plastic one Caleb had brought out a few years back, so there'd be somewhere to sit when the green chair was occupied, and folded her hands in her lap. I know you're upset, she said. Yes, your mother loved you very much. I know. She was just worried about Vivienne. The kids are young, and Kevin's, Dottie. He said it quietly. Did you know about this? She didn't answer right away. That was its own answer. How long? He asked. Your mother mentioned it to me. Before, when she was still, Dottie stopped. She asked me what I thought. I told her she should do what felt right to her. I didn't think it was my place to. You knew 18 months ago. I thought she might change it back. I thought it was. I didn't know it would. Did anyone else know? The pause this time was longer. Caleb looked at her. Your cousin Frank, she said finally. And I think Helen might have had some idea. He nodded once. Stood up. Went back inside. He did not have a dramatic scene in the kitchen. He did not raise his voice or throw anything. He got his coat from the hook by the door, which still had his mother's keys hanging on it. The little brass key ring shaped like a bird, something she'd bought at a craft fair somewhere, years ago, and he said goodnight to the room and drove home. That night, he sat at his kitchen table and wrote down a list of everything he'd done for his mother in 8 years. Not because he wanted to keep score. He didn't believe in keeping score. He wrote it down because he needed to confirm that it had actually happened, that it wasn't something he'd imagined, this long accumulation of small necessities, the grocery trips, the insurance calls, the medication, the appointments, the drives in the dark, the painting, the dish. 47 line items. He counted them once, then closed the notebook. Then he called an attorney. His name was Robert Gaines, and he came recommended by a colleague at school whose father had contested a will 3 years prior. Robert Gaines was 51, efficient, and delivered information without emotional wrapper, which Caleb appreciated. The facts, as Robert laid them out, were not encouraging. The amendment was legal. Ruth had been assessed and found competent. The assessment had been performed by a licensed physician. The fact that the visit during which the amendment was made had been arranged by Vivienne was relevant, but not, by itself, grounds for a successful challenge. Undue influence was the angle Caleb would need to demonstrate that Vivienne had exploited a position of trust to pressure a vulnerable person into changing a legal document. Can we demonstrate that? Caleb asked. We can try to, Robert said. The outcome is uncertain. These cases are expensive and difficult to prove. You're looking at a process of 18 months to 2 years, possibly more. What's the realistic probability of success? Robert Gaines took off his glasses and cleaned them. 40, 45%. Maybe. On a good day, Caleb filed anyway. He called Vivienne and told her he was contesting the will. She cried. Kevin called him an hour later and said some things that Caleb listened to without responding to, and then ended the call. His Aunt Dottie sent a text. I hope you'll reconsider. Your mother wouldn't have wanted this. He read that text 3 times. Then he put his phone face down on the counter and graded papers for 2 hours. The lawsuit ran for 11 months before it settled. Settlement, as Robert Gaines explained it, meant that both parties agreed to a modified arrangement outside of court. Vivienne retained the house, and 55% of the savings. Caleb received 45%, and both parties agreed not to pursue further litigation. It's not a win, Robert said. I know, Caleb said, but it's better than what the will said. Yes. He signed the settlement agreement on a Wednesday afternoon in Robert's office, in a building downtown with a view of the river. It was April by then, almost a year after the will reading. He shook Robert's hand, got in his car, and drove to the hardware store in Westerville for no reason in particular, not to buy anything. He just ended up there and sat in the parking lot for a while. He thought about the last time he'd been to that hardware store. 3 coats of Wren green. 3 hours on a cold October Saturday. His mother, watching from the window. He drove home. He had a stack of ungraded essays on the Ottoman Empire waiting on his kitchen table. He made coffee, sat down, and started reading. The Ottoman Empire's decline was not sudden. It was the accumulation of pressures no single administration was equipped to resolve. He underlined that sentence. Not because it was particularly good history, it was competent. The student had understood the basic idea, but because something about it felt true in a way that extended past the page. The summer that followed was quiet. Vivienne and Caleb did not speak. The house in Bexley was sold. Vivienne handled it, as she had every right to do with property that was now hers, and Caleb drove past it once, a few weeks after the closing. Not intending to stop. He stopped anyway. The green rocking chair was gone. He had not thought to ask about it. It had not been named in any legal document. It was just an old painted chair on a porch that was now someone else's. He sat in his car across the street and looked at the empty porch and felt something he didn't immediately have a name for. Later that week, he drove back to the house. The new owners weren't in. He left a note in the mailbox asking if they had the rocking chair and if they'd be willing to sell it. He included his number. They called 3 days later. They hadn't wanted it. They'd left it at the curb for trash pickup. It was gone. He thanked them and hung up. That weekend, he helped his colleague Marcus move a sofa into a new apartment, and on the way back from Marcus's place, he passed a house with a few pieces of furniture on the curb. An end table, some boxes, and a rocking chair, a different one, wrong shape, painted white, that someone had apparently decided to leave behind. He kept driving. In September, Dottie organized what she called a family dinner. She sent a group text to Caleb, Vivienne, and Kevin, who would be visiting for the occasion, and 4 other family members, cousins, and their spouses, framing it as a chance to come together after everything. She had booked a private room at a restaurant in Short North. She had arranged flowers. She had, presumably, updated the whiteboard calendar in her kitchen. Caleb almost didn't go. He told Petra about it at her kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon, while Dostoevsky the cat walked across the newspaper he was reading. "Don't go," Petra said, pouring instant coffee into a mug that said "World's Okayest Nurse," which her residents had given her. "They're family," Caleb said. "So, historically speaking, and I know you're tired of me saying that. I am. Cutting people off, without attempting to reestablish communication, leaves a different kind of damage than the original injury." Petra sat down and looked at him over her mug. "Caleb, are you going because you want to go, or because you think you should be someone who goes?" He didn't answer right away. "Those are different reasons," she said. "I know." He went anyway. The private room Dottie had booked fit 10 people around a long table. There were candles, the small tea light kind in glass holders, and a floral centerpiece that no one moved, even though it made it slightly difficult to see the people across from you. The restaurant was the kind of place that wrote seasonal specials on a chalkboard and had exposed brick on one wall. Caleb arrived on time, which meant he was the second person there after Dottie, who was already rearranging place settings. She hugged him with the specific energy of someone managing relief. "I'm so glad you came," she said. "Sure," he said. The others arrived in the next 15 minutes. Cousins he saw at most once a year. Their spouses. His Aunt Helen. Vivian came in with Kevin, who shook Caleb's hand with the careful neutrality of a man who had been briefed on exactly how warm to be. Vivian hugged him. He hugged her back. They sat. They ordered. They talked. And this is the part where I need you to stay with me, because what happened next was not a confrontation. There was no scene, no raised voices, nothing that the other diners, if they could have heard through the walls, would have found interesting. What happened was much quieter than that. Caleb sat at the table and watched. He watched Dottie steer every conversation away from anything uncomfortable with the reflexive efficiency of someone who has been doing this their whole life. He watched his cousins laugh at Kevin's joke about airports. He watched Vivienne tell a story about her youngest kid's first soccer game, and he watched everyone at the table lean in, delighted, because Vivienne was good at telling stories, had always been good at it, and the story was genuinely charming. He watched the candles. He watched the chalkboard with the specials. He ate the food that came, which was fine lamb chops with something green. And at some point, he couldn't have said exactly when he realized that not a single person at that table had asked him a question about his life. Not one. They had asked Vivienne about her kids. They had asked Kevin about his business recovery, which was apparently going better now. They had asked Dottie about her niece's upcoming wedding. They had asked Caleb, "Is the parking bad over here? And did you want wine? And is this the right amount on the tip?" Logistics, not questions. Not one of them had asked what the last 8 years had been like. Not one of them had said his mother's name to him directly. The way you say someone's name when you want to acknowledge a loss is real. Not one of them had said, "You were there. We know you were there. That mattered." They hadn't asked because, and this landed in him slowly, the way cold comes into a room when you've been sitting still for a while, they didn't think they needed to. He was just there. He had been just there for 8 years. It was a given. It was the condition of the room, the same way the brick wall was a condition of the restaurant. You don't ask the wall how it's doing. He looked at Vivienne. She was mid-sentence. Something about a renovation in their Seattle kitchen. She looked happy. Not falsely happy. Genuinely happy. In the way people are happy when they're in a room where they feel seen. Caleb looked around the table. He thought about the 47 line items in the notebook in his kitchen drawer. He thought about driving to Westerville for a specific shade of green. He thought about his mother saying, "You're a good boy," Caleb through the window. He thought about the ceramic dish on the porch railing with no seat in it, because there was no longer a porch, no longer a railing, no longer a house to go back to. And he understood something very clearly, in a way he had only half understood before. This was not about the money. The money had been the symptom. This was about something older and simpler, and much harder to argue with in front of a lawyer. The assumption. The assumption that he would be there, that he would do the thing, that his presence was so reliable it required no acknowledgement, no reciprocation, no naming. He had been so structurally dependable that everyone in his family had quietly, without malice, stopped treating him like a person who might need something from them, and started treating him like a given. And the worst part, the part that sat in his chest like something hard, was that he had allowed it, not passively, not without noticing, but actively, consistently, by showing up every time and not once asking, "Do you see me doing this?" Because he had genuinely thought that being seen wasn't something you asked for, that if you did the thing long enough and well enough, the seeing would come naturally. He knew now that it didn't, that some people needed to be told, and that he had never told anyone. He put his fork down, quietly. He picked up his wine glass and took a sip, and set it down, and looked at the candle for a moment. Then he asked Dottie about the seating for the wedding, because she was still talking about it, and the conversation moved on, and the evening moved on, and at 9:15, he said he had to be up early, and said goodnight to everyone, and drove home. He did not cry on the way home. He'd done his crying in other places, at other times. He sat in his car in his driveway for a while, with the engine off. Then he got out, went inside, and opened the notebook to the page with the 47 line items, and added one more, September 14. Family dinner. Attended. Not asked a single question about my life. He closed the notebook. He went to bed. He slept better than he expected to. I've been sitting with Caleb's story for a while now, and I want to tell you what I think. But I also want to tell you where I'm not sure, because I think both of those things are important, and I'm not interested in giving you a tidy conclusion that doesn't account for the parts that don't fit neatly. Here's what I think I know. There is a specific category of harm that doesn't have good language in English. We have words for betrayal, for abandonment, for cruelty. We have a reasonable vocabulary for the dramatic end of things. What we don't have great words for is the harm of being taken for granted so thoroughly and for so long that the person doing it has genuinely convinced themselves they are not doing anything wrong. Vivienne Morrison did not think of herself as someone who had wronged her brother. I want to be clear about that, because I think it matters. She thought of herself as someone who had helped her mother fulfill a wish. She thought of herself as someone managing a difficult family situation with the tools available to her. She had probably, by the time that family dinner rolled around, processed her version of what happened and arrived at a place she could live with. That's not sociopathy. That's something much more common and maybe more frightening. A person who is genuinely good in the ways they've been trained to be good, and genuinely blind in the ways they've been allowed to stay blind. The cruelty wasn't in what she did. It was in what she never thought to look at. And here's where I'm less sure. Caleb's response. After the dinner, he withdrew. Not all at once, he didn't vanish. He didn't send letters. He didn't make declarations. But slowly, over the months that followed, he stopped returning calls that weren't urgent. He stopped attending the events Dottie organized. He sent birthday texts instead of calling. He maintained the surface geometry of family while removing himself from the interior of it. He built, piece by piece, a life in which his family existed at its edges and not its center. I understand why he did that. I genuinely do. After years of being the one who showed up, the decision to stop showing up, not dramatically, but systematically, has its own logic, its own dignity, even. But I've thought about this a lot, and I keep coming back to something uncomfortable. The people he withdrew from weren't only the people who'd hurt him. They were also the cousins who didn't know the full story. The aunt who probably knew more than she'd said and had her own complicated reasons for it. The family at large, which contains people who maybe would have asked different questions if someone had told them there were questions to ask. I'm not saying Caleb owed them anything. I'm not saying the burden was on him to educate people who should have been paying better attention. I'm saying that sometimes the cost of protecting yourself from a wound is also the cost of closing a door that had other people on the other side. I don't know if Caleb thought about that. I don't know if he'd agree with me if I asked him. Honestly, maybe that's not the point. Maybe the point is just that these things have costs, and the costs are real. And they don't always match the shape of the harm that caused them. What I do know is this. Caleb Morrison spent 8 years in service of something that mattered. He did it without ceremony, without scorekeeping, without making other people feel guilty for not helping. He did it because he loved his mother, and because he was built, somewhere in the part of himself he'd never really examined, to be the person who shows up. The tragedy, if you want to call it that, isn't that he was betrayed. The tragedy is that he'd built his whole sense of self around being needed, and the moment the needing was over, he found out that no one had been keeping track. That's not Vivienne's fault entirely. It's not even fully the family's fault. Some of it, and I say this with real care, not judgment, is Caleb's too, for never saying, "I'm doing this, and it matters, and I need you to know that." For assuming that love was legible without language. It's a hard thing to admit about yourself. Harder still to change. Here's my question for you, the one I want you to take home. Is there someone in your life who has been painting the green chair for years and hasn't told you? And if there is, what would it really cost you to simply say their name in a room full of people and mean it? It's been almost 2 years since that dinner. Caleb still teaches history at Columbus Central. He's still in the same third-floor classroom. The radiator still rattles in February. He still goes to the coffee shop on Saturday mornings. Large black coffee, plain bagel, toasted, corner booth. He bought a used copy of a book about the Ottoman Empire last fall. One of his students had written a paper that was better than it had any right to be, and he wanted to trace where she'd picked up the framing. He found the book at a shop in Clintonville for $4. The rocking chair, the green rocking chair, is in his garage. He'd found one at an estate sale in Worthington, 2 months after the one at the curb had been lost. It's the wrong model, slightly different arm style, but it's wood, and he repainted it Wren green last spring using the code still saved in his phone. He hasn't put it anywhere yet. It's in the garage, against the wall, next to his winter tires. Sometimes, he goes in there to get something, and it's just there. He talks to Vivienne twice a year now, maybe 3 times. She called in the spring to tell him her oldest had gotten into a summer program in Washington, D.C. He asked a few questions. She asked how school was. The conversation lasted 14 minutes. It was fine. It was exactly as fine as it was. He called Dottie on her birthday in July. She sounded glad to hear from him. She updated the whiteboard, he imagines. Blue. Still blue. One afternoon in October, he was sitting at his desk after the last class of the day, grading papers, when one of his seniors knocked on the open door. A kid named Theodore, who everyone called Theo, who was quiet in a specific way that Caleb recognized. The way good teachers learn to recognize certain kinds of quiet. Theo stood in the doorway, holding his backpack, and looked at Caleb for a moment. "Mr. Morrison," he said. "Are you okay?" Caleb looked up from the paper he was reading. He tilted his head slightly. "What makes you ask that?" Theo shrugged. "I don't know. You've seemed kind of not sad, exactly. Just somewhere else." Caleb looked at him for a moment. Outside the window, the athletic field was empty, the grass going brown at the edges. Early autumn taking everything down. "I'm learning something," he said. Theo waited. "The difference between what I owe people and what I give them." He paused. "It sounds simple, It's taking a while. Theo nodded slowly, the way teenagers do when something lands in the right place, even if they can't quite articulate why. He said goodnight, and his footsteps went down the hallway, and then it was quiet. Caleb looked back down at the paper on his desk. He picked up his pen. The green chair is still in the garage. He hasn't decided yet what to do with it. Some mornings he thinks he'll put it on his front porch in the spring, when it's warm enough again, when Ohio finally remembers what color it's supposed to be. Other times he thinks maybe it belongs somewhere else. Maybe it belongs to whatever comes next in a life that's still, as far as he can tell, mostly in front of him. He hasn't decided yet. That seems right to me. Some things take longer than other things. Some things you carry for a while, before you know where they go. He paints it, though. He keeps it the right color. Maybe that's enough. Maybe that's the thing. If this story stayed with you, if there's someone in your life you thought of while you were listening, you don't have to do anything with that right now. But you might want to remember it. Those are usually the thoughts worth keeping. Take care of yourselves out there.